So normally at the start of my talks, I like to have everybody stand up and hug their neighbor. We're not going to do that today, but just, hopefully we'll have a good time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for sticking around. I will say the beer is not being handed out yet, so you're not missing that. I may run long, but I won't run that long. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so this is managing chaos in production, testing versus monitoring. Sort of a treatise on the state of our industry on some level. Hopefully focused on that part, but you never know where it's going to go. So I thought about calling this talk maybe something different, and this is a title that maybe would be more apt, but some people say this is a bit standoffish, monitoring. It is like testing. It's very similar, but you do it in production, so it is quite a bit more important, actually. And I didn't want to be standoffish. Sometimes that just happens naturally, and so I apologize if that happens later in this talk, because it might. So I didn't go with that title. If you are here and you're at one of those companies where your boss makes you write a report on what is it you saw, and what was the talks about, what did you learn, that kind of a thing. So I have this little phrasing that you can use. This is a discussion on trade-offs between testing and monitoring and how to apply them in a DevOps lifecycle. That should get you out of trouble with your boss. All right, write that down, it'll be good. Like many talks you've seen here today, I've had this slide which is about me, and I'm going to try to do this on the fly, which is, so we always put these in because the marketing people are like, you're spending time, so you have to have a thing. And what really this should be is here are my biases and why I have the opinions I have. So one is I've had a lot of jobs, and I'm really old, and I've seen a lot of problems. The second thing is I work at a small company, so I can have a pretty fancy title. Apparently anyone can be president of the US these days. I'm a bit young, but generally it seems like anybody can do it. So I've built a lot of big systems, hundreds of millions of users, lots of transactions, all that good stuff, money changing hands, things like that, which make me probably biased more towards that type of environment. But I will also couch that a little bit that I don't build systems where people generally die if something goes wrong. So if you're in that business, take it all with a grain of salt. And then I like to take people's money to solve their problems. I have also been known to not take their money and solve problems as well. I am on Twitter. How many of you have heard of Twitter? Okay, that's good, although surprisingly low number of hands. So I'm at RobTreat2 on Twitter. If you love this talk and it's the greatest thing, feel free to tweet me there. That's awesome. I also have an email address, which is robert.treat@creditive.us. If you hate the talk, if you're sure that I'm wrong, if you'd like to write me a 5-page email on that, please send it to my email address. I will love to read that and then dispose of it in the most proper way. I have a blog. I occasionally write stuff there. It's exilla.net. I probably won't post the slides there, but the slides will be up on SlideShare, because again, I'm old and I still use SlideShare. So, and I probably will tweet out a link to the slides once I'm done. We'll see. All right, so with all of that sort of pre-stuff out of the way, let's go on and talk about testing. So testing is a thing. I assume everybody's sort of familiar with testing. You've heard of it. You know some people that do it. Maybe you haven't done it too much, but there's other people who are really into it. And if you had to think of one word to sum up what testing is all about, it's a big field. There's a lot of pieces to it. And I think that one word that you would have to come up with is it's required, right? You really can't not do testing. That's not an option here. And I don't want to pretend that not testing is a thing that I'm going to advocate for. But what I will say for sure is that testing is not, it's not enough. It's not going to cover all your bases, and that's sort of an issue. And there's a lot of different ways you can do testing. There's a lot of testing that people like to advocate for. Nowadays, we like to automate the testing, right? That's a good thing. How many of you do one of these kinds of testing in your organization? Maybe not you, but somebody's doing some of this. Anybody, your company actually does all of these things? So yeah, a lot fewer hands, because that's usually how that works. So all of these are good, and obviously depending on the space that you're in and the type of technologies you're using, which is more appropriate, unit testing or functional testing, or are these even different things? You can have those kind of debates. We have bars for that reason. And I think but to me, it doesn't exactly matter which kind of testing you pick, right? You can pick any of these, or you can pick all of these. And what you will find is at the end of the day, you can have all the testing you want, but it can't guarantee that you're not going to have problems. And I say that like, it's not profound. It's not something that to me at least, like it seems like almost it'd be common sense. And sometimes I wonder about when you go to a conference and you give a talk like this and you're like, I'm saying what I think is the most obvious thing. But a friend of mine we were actually at the bar the other night. So sometimes I do therapy at the bar, sometimes I do it in a conference talk. So we were at the bar the other night and he said to me, like they had a big crash like the previous week and the CTO really went to him and he was like, we hit another bug like after we deployed. I think we really need to slow down our deployments so we have more time to test. Right? And I'm just like, and I couldn't believe when my friend said this to me, I was like, you've been fighting a battle here at this company that I don't think you're going to win. And there are people out there in the industry that would tell you that this is true, right? Like that the answer is you need to deploy less frequently, you need to slow down those deployments, you need to add more testing, because that way you'll make sure that you don't have any problems, right? It'll get out to production and it'll work well. Not exactly true. So there's a lot of problems there with testing, right? There's a lot of reasons that testing doesn't solve this. And if you're thinking like, I'm pretty sure I could test my way to no problems, let me tell you about some of those problems that are out there. The first thing that you start with is you see that testing is very deterministic, right? And it needs to be deterministic in most cases, right? You're trying to compare results that you're going to have to like future results, and it all needs to come out the same way in a way that's expected and understood. And so when you add randomness into tests, it doesn't work very well. Unfortunately, production doesn't work like testing. Let's start with a data problem, right? And data can cause a lot of problems, as it turns out. There's quantity of data, which can always be an issue, right? The frequency of data that you're getting, that's a thing that is constantly changing in most production systems. Quality of data, usually all over the map, most of the systems that I have seen. And you can try to understand and specify some boundaries for this in your testing, and you kind of have to. But it becomes really difficult, right? If you think like, I'm going to automate a bunch of testing against the production data set, that's going to work great when the production data set, is like one server, 10 gigs of data, whatever. You start getting into like multi-terabyte systems and you're like, it's not that you can't test those, you can even do automation. You're certainly not going to download it to your laptop every morning to get a fresh copy of production, right? Like you really have to start thinking about all the logistics that are going to go into that. And even when you're trying to think of those cases, you probably start to miss stuff. How many of you are familiar with the Wolf plus 585 example? We don't have QA engineers in here, which is good because, again, I might ascend them. So Wolf 585 is the shorthand for this name, which is Hubert Blaine Wolf and I don't know. So this is a real name. It's a real person. He holds the world record for the longest known name. However they decide that, he has the world record for that. So he has a real legal name that is this long. And I would pretty much guess that most people, if he tried to sign up for whatever service that you are trying to engineer, he does not make it through your system, right? Like he is probably going to hit some kind of length error, some data is going to get trimmed, it's going to be a problem before you get through it. And maybe that's okay, right? It does kind of depend on the system you're building. If he doesn't make it through, maybe he's the only one. Although I'll argue, since he's a senior, I assume there's a junior and they're not going to make it either. If they have any more kids, the third is not going to make it. Maybe the fourth, it's tricky. When you get to the 10th, it'll just be an X. It'll be fine. So maybe it's fine, but understand that, there are going to be these people who show up in the world that are going to have names that are not the same as what you may be thinking or expecting, right? And certainly we see that if you go from, a particular country into the international space, this really starts to be an issue. And of course, like most issues, the name thing is related to users, right? Most users have a name, they need some kind of identifier. And really, to be honest, most problems are because of users. I generally have told people if you could just get rid of the users, you'd get rid of pretty much all the problems. I mean, you'd still have the engineers and the business people, but other than that, most of your problems go away. A definition of a user I like to find, is pretty useful to think about. I didn't make this up, but it's essentially a distributed fault injection test suite for production, right? That's users. And this next example, I swear I've been known to make last-minute slides. This is not an example I made at the last minute. It's a little bit about virus control and that kind of thing. And actually, as I was reviewing this, here's a maximum I'm going to put out. When you go to your next DevOps conference, if 75% of the stuff that the person on stage is talking about doesn't apply to an outbreak of disease across nations and countries, it's probably not DevOps. But the thing I'm going to talk about is actually this thing called the corrupted blood incident. So here we may have some sort of hardcore gamers or whatever from back in the day. Anybody here ever heard of this before? Yeah, so there's some, okay, so I'm going to give this a very high level. Don't get mad at me. I'm glossing over lots of parts of this, but we'll bring it out to the generic audience, and hopefully this will make sense. So if you're familiar with games like World of Warcraft, right, these big, long, massive online multiplayer games, so there was one of these, I think about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that now. They introduced a game mechanic which they called corrupted blood. And basically the way that this worked was, if you as a player got this, it was like an infection. You would come down with, essentially like a disease that would eventually kill you. You'd lose health points in the game until you died. And there were two ways to get rid of this. You could either find somebody else and kind of tag them and give them the corrupted blood so you could get rid of it, or you could die. And if you died, anyone who was in the general area that you were in would also become infected with it. So that's an interesting game mechanic. And then the people who made the game, they were like, okay, this we think will be interesting and this will be a fun thing for people to work with, but we realize you need to be of a certain skill level to be able to figure out how to deal with this. So we're going to put it way out, in the outer reaches of the game so that not everyone's going to stumble over this. And then any player who finds it, well, they'll be experienced and it'll be an interesting challenge for them and we'll see what they come up with. Right. So then they put the thing out there and at first it's fine. People think it's interesting and, whatever. But then eventually somebody comes along who is experienced in the game, has a high-level character, that kind of thing, and realizes well, you know what I'm going to do? Because I'm kind of freaking out because I just got a corrupted blood thing on me and I'm dying slowly and I don't want my character to die. Let me go back to town. I have an ability like teleport, so I can just pop back into town whenever I want to, and it's not going to be a problem. And so the user did that, and suddenly they're now in one of the big cities in the game, and it turns out in the cities, there's a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience, who have new characters that don't have a lot of health, right, who don't understand how to get rid of this game mechanic. And so immediately people start getting infected, right? And because they're low-level characters, they start dying, which means everybody around them starts getting affected. And this sounds like what you thought you might be getting into when you came to Pasadena. I can't completely say. So the next screen is not what we want to see on Sunday. When the next screen is basically what happened in the game, which was everybody started dying, right? They couldn't get it. When they would respawn in the city, they would pretty much immediately die because they would get this disease and that was it. And so it was so bad they essentially had to shut down the game and do rolling restarts of servers and whatnot to clean this out of the system so that they could actually continue to have gameplay. Right? So they had introduced this game mechanic which they thought would be fun, and somebody came along and was like, I don't even think they were malicious when they did it. They just thought I'm not sure how to solve this problem. And they came up with this idea, and the idea kind of ended up ruining the game, right? They had to take it back out. So users, they're clever, right? They think of things that we don't always think of. Even if you're the designer of the system and you're I know how this system works. I can think of all the combinations. You cannot think of all the combinations. Right? There's just not enough foresight out there to be able to come up with all of these ideas. There's too many use cases, especially as your systems grow, right? There's more and more machines that are involved. There's, more complex network situations that you run into, different technologies come into play. Different user bases will use things in different ways. It's just too much for anyone to really be able to predict, all of the future options. And then also, you can just have basic changes to assumptions. Right? And when those assumptions change about how the business is supposed to work or how the server should be operating, that kind of a thing, it's a thing you just cannot plan for these in all cases. Sometimes it's like a security thing, right? When you find suddenly you need to patch a system and then suddenly the system now is 10% slower, right? Because apparently we can't use those CPU injection routines that we thought we were going to use or whatever, right? So all of those things happen. They make things hard. You can't predict it. And so that's why I say, you can't ever add enough tests, right? Even if you're constantly adding tests every time you run into a problem, you'll still be needing to add more tests. It's a never-ending battle. And so then really you got to think about, what is the actual point of why we're doing all this testing? If it's not going to be so that we don't have bugs in production, which isn't going to work, why are we actually doing it? Well, I will tell you for sure, 100% code coverage is not the goal. When you start out writing tests and you're thinking That's usually a metric people kind of zero in on. We'll know we've got good enough tests when we get 100% code coverage. No, doesn't matter, right? That's not the goal. That's not really why you start writing tests. I will offer that the idea is the goal of testing is to win a confidence game. That's really the only reason why we're doing this testing. We want to be confident enough that when we push something out into production, that there's a reasonable chance it's not going to blow up in our face, right? And, reasonable, that's an interesting word. People can have different opinions on how much is reasonable, but that's basically the game that we're playing here. And for different people, that amount is going to be different even on the same system, right? The more you think you understand about the system, probably the less testing you would think that you would need because you have more confidence in how it's going to work. That can kind of be a bad thing at times. Often our mental models and how systems work don't actually align. But take it for what it is. Testing is very good for known knowns. If you have certain things that you want to make sure do continue to work, right? Doing mock testing on APIs and that kind of thing, that's great. I don't knock it. I would say we should do it. Just remember, right? There's that whole category of unknown unknowns that people talk about, and that's production. It's all unknown unknowns. And if you can't test it, all right. So then what do, right? And now comes the other half. It's monitoring. It's a good generic term. Why monitor? Okay, now I feel like I shouldn't really actually have to explain this to everybody here. Hopefully anybody here doesn't do monitoring? Okay. I know. So yeah, that's one of the problems. So I do some consulting work, and it turns out there are a lot of people in the industry who don't think you need to do monitoring, and that's really unfortunate. So so if you are not convinced that you need to do monitoring, I have a couple of things to think about. Again, I think we all agree software is never perfect, right? It tends to have issues. Systems are complex. Everybody here thinks systems are complex? I mean, you must, because we're all about infrastructure as code, and all of those systems are complex. External dependencies is a thing that really gets overlooked a lot. I've known many a company that was like, oh, you know what would be awesome? If users could log in with Facebook. That would be awesome, because now we could sell our service to 1 billion other people, and they already have logins to the system, and it's going to be great, right? That is awesome. And then something will happen with Facebook, and then suddenly the login is down for some period of time, and your system stops working, and you're like, all our servers look like they're good. Yeah, well, Facebook is down, you're down. And you would never think. You're like, well, Facebook's got to be building better stuff than me, right? They got a lot of smart engineers. But they have outages too, because everybody has them. It's a thing. Monitoring also can help you be proactive instead of reactive, right? It's not always great if the reason that you actually go look at your production systems is the customer calling you on the phone saying, hey, I think the site is down. That's not good. You don't want to, you'd like to do something a little bit before that happens. Okay, so monitoring versus testing, right? If the goal of testing is to win the confidence game, to be reasonably confident we can push things to production, then I will say perhaps, maybe not definitely, but perhaps, the goal of monitoring is really just to empower resiliency, right? Whether it's on the technical side, the business side, operations side, dev side, whatever side, however many sides you need, we're trying to empower resiliency within our organization. And that is kind of, to me, the heart of why we're building out these monitoring systems. And it's important to keep that in mind because, in production, things are going to change a lot, right? Again, we can't have assumptions about production that are going to be static. We know it's going to change from users to data and all that kind of stuff. If this is a constantly evolving system, right, even if you don't change the code, there's still things that are going on. The internet itself is not a static thing, right? That can be a problem. So you got to think about that, and you are going to have a question on what is it that you should be monitoring, right? This is going to come up eventually as you start to roll things out. And in the South, from Maryland, technically it's part of the South, they tell me. So you could use this phrasing, which is, in God we trust, all others we monitor. There's some countries that might apply to. I can't actually say who that is, but whatever. So you could take this approach. That's not exactly the phrasing I would use. I don't necessarily, from my government, I don't like it. From my systems, I probably would say, okay, it's not so bad. Certainly most of us have a lot of stuff we need to monitor if we think about it on the engineering side of things, right? Like all the servers that you have, whether it's systems or databases or web servers or whatever, right? Your Jenkins system, whatever, what's going on, the laptops that your users are on, there's all that kind of stuff. Performance stuff versus functionality, things like that, the user behavior. Are users suddenly starting to use a new feature that they never used before? Those kinds of things can be interesting, or are they using it in a way that you didn't expect? I know like on Twitter, there's that thing to like a thing, you like a tweet that's out there. I use that as like bookmarks because I don't know why, I'm dysfunctional. Other people like 1,000 things. I've got like 20 things that I like, and that's about it. And I don't really ever like anything unless I'm like, I need to go back and get it. And I know you could store those URLs like someplace else, but that's where I do it. So, people use software in different ways. And I don't know who designed that feature, but if they thought they were going to design it the way I use it, and then people are like, I'm going to like every tweet that mentions DevOps, right? Like that person's use case a little bit different than mine. So as you're rolling out this monitoring, you think about what do I have to put out there, right? Thinking about, do I actually have enough monitoring? That's a valid question. I think it's also equally valid to say, do you have too much monitoring? I've certainly walked into places where there was no monitoring, but on the other side, they had way too much. You couldn't actually figure out what was going on. It turns out most monitoring vendors maybe be able to make something that scales to like 100,000 machines and make graphs for all of those, but being able to search against the 100,000 machines, like that's a little bit too hard, apparently. So you can definitely have too much monitoring and not be able to find out what you need to find out. So then the question, what is important? Right? Like all things, it takes some balance. Maybe when you say what is important, it might be like, well, what do I need to alert on? Because anytime you start adding monitoring, the question of alerting comes up, that becomes an issue. And I do think it can inform these decisions, right? When you think about what should I monitor, think about what you need to alert on, but not in the classical sense. I mentioned Twitter a few times. I do remember a number of times back in the day, they've mostly solved these problems. The idea that like Twitter would be up and running, you could check their web servers and like ping them, they would respond. You do like HTTP checks, you get like a 200, but your tweets would still get lost, right? Like people wouldn't actually see the tweet that you sent and that kind of a thing. I know even now I sort of wonder. I will say like Gmail is my current thing where I have that issue that like somebody sends you an email and you cannot find it no matter what, so you ask them to resend it and then it's threaded with the other one. And you're like, I searched every word in that email the first time, and it never showed up until they resent it, and now I have both of them, and I don't know what happened. The indexing is hard, right? So like, it may look like it's functional, it may look like everything is up and running, but that doesn't mean that it is actually working in the way that's necessary, right? It doesn't mean it's actually serving the purpose, right? The purpose of the web server is not a 200 response code. Yeah, you probably want one, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting what you actually wanted out of that system. One of the best ways that this was ever driven home to me, we had a customer we were doing operations work for, and we were putting out monitoring in their system. And this is a little ways back where we use these things called servers. And in the server, you would put like hardware. And so the hardware is made of metal, and it had like disks in it and stuff. So it's like before the cloud. But anyway, so we're putting servers into place, and we're putting monitoring on them. And one of the things we would monitor was temperature of the servers. Right? Because we all, like back in the day, thought like, oh, if the server gets hot, like it's not going to function, it'll melt, apparently, because metal melts really easy. Some studies have proven we may have been a little bit overly paranoid about that. Not that humans get overly paranoid about things, but anyway, so we're wiring this up, and we're putting these temperature monitors in place and trying to figure out alerts. He's like, you guys are wasting a lot of time on these temperature sensors that you're putting in and doing monitoring and alerts on that stuff. It's like, I don't care about that stuff. Like, I got a list of things over here that I need to actually get done, and you're wasting your time putting monitors in place. And we're like, well, yeah, but if it doesn't work, it's going to be a problem. And he's like, temperature sensors? I don't give a fork, I guess. I don't give a fork if the data center is on fire as long as I'm making money. And you're like, well, that's an interesting take. But I thought about it, and I was like, well, he is kind of right. If the server was on fire, but he was still getting orders processed, and he was still making money, like, I don't know that is necessarily bad. It's probably a sign that there's going to be a problem, but at that very moment, there's not a problem. He's still selling all his stuff. So he's kind of got a point there. That might be a little bit extreme, but it's something to think about, right? That like, oh, just because the temperature is elevated, if everything is functioning as normal as far as the business is concerned, as far as why you've actually built that system, may not be that important. And there's a lot of things that we tend to monitor. We get excessive about some of this stuff because we're looking for things like that. Like it's a little bit out of normal. And that's, one of those questions as you're building out your monitoring infrastructure and what do you want to put in place. It isn't actually what most people, I think, have said for the last few years, and I have said this. I've used that phrase, like, monitor all the things, right? Like, you've all heard that. There's like stickers and T-shirts for that. So part of it's probably my fault because I've said that, I know. I will also say monitoring vendors, most of them want you to monitor all the things. And not necessarily because it helps you, it's because, well, I don't want to say, there's a Datadog dog. Every time I'm like shamed, I see the shirt. So everyone except for Datadog, those other monitoring vendors, the more metrics you put into the system, the more money they make. I'm not saying they have ulterior motives, to be fair. And like I said, Datadog definitely does not have ulterior motives. But maybe some of them do, I don't know. So I'm just saying we need to be smarter about how we talk about monitoring in the industry, right? Like just saying like, well, you should monitor all the things. That's not actually going to do it. And we use these terms pretty loosely. There's been some, I would like to say, discussion in the industry on how to have these conversations. When I say discussion in the industry, mostly I mean Twitter beef. So there's been discussions around what we mean when we say monitoring and some of these other things. I'm going to just go with the word visibility because I think it's neutral enough that it won't cause any trouble. So when we're talking about monitoring, we're talking really about visibility into our systems. We want to see what is going on. And instead of the whole like metric collection for all the things, that's actually fine. If you can do that, if you can add visibility for all of those metrics that are in there, whether you're exactly collecting it or when you're collecting and whatnot, that's not necessarily bad, right? To be able to go see all that stuff. I want to be able to go see what the temperature is on a server if I have to, right? And more, I really want to never have to do that again, which is why we have the cloud. But if I need to go look at those numbers, if it's IOPS or CPUs or whatever, right, it doesn't matter. You want to be able to go look at it if you need to. Maybe you don't have to collect that data all the time. But what's really important is thinking about which of those metrics that we're doing actually affect what is going on in the business, right? What is the purpose of the organization? How do we monitor the health of the organization? And then how do we correlate that back to what we're talking about? And that's really the approach that I think most people should be looking at. And probably as engineers, like, I know certainly when I was an up-and-coming young engineer many, many years ago, I certainly didn't think about it in that way. Like, I really focused on the server and then, going up from there. And really, it's better to think about, again, how does the business function? What are the organizational goals? The funny part is they actually do this kind of, well, not all of them. I mean, there's startups and whatnot that are maybe more dysfunctional. But a lot of companies do have like KPIs that they use, right? And those KPIs are supposed to be tied to things that are important. If you really have no idea what those might be, I would probably get something related to like user signups, orders processed, right? Like sales numbers. And you can probably figure that out on most of the systems that you operate. Just start with something like that and then figure out how do we correlate that into data about the actual systems and engineering that's going on. I will give you an example of why this starts to become important. So one particular customer that we worked with is an online marketing company, right? Did a lot of e-commerce, sold a lot of stuff on the web, had roughly 100 million users. We stopped counting at 100 million, more or less. They sent roughly 1 billion emails a month. That sounds like a big number, but if you have 100 million users, 1 billion emails is not super like spammy, it's just slightly spammy. It's like chicken spam, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, so 300,000 lines of source code across their infrastructure. So that's a lot of code to go looking through when you have a problem. We collected about 5,600 metrics on that system, right, across all the servers and whatnot. So if somebody was like, said, hey, can you look at the graph or whatever, like you kind of wanted them to give you a link because you didn't want to scroll through a list of 5,600 metrics. Like all good stories, this one started with a phone call where the client called us and said, I'm looking at one of these graphs, and the way that we usually try to preach to our customers is pretty much everybody should have access to all the information that you can. Obviously, sometimes you have to be a little bit careful with that. But he was looking at one of the revenue graphs, right, that we were generating out of the system, and he was like, I'm looking at it, I'm seeing this kind of weird dip. And this is not the way the thing is supposed to look. Like, see, these other ones are up higher, this one is lower, that's bad. What did you guys screw up? We're like, I don't know what we screwed up. I'm pretty sure we didn't screw up anything. Nobody had reported a problem. Maybe, I don't know, maybe your sales team has an issue. Did you think of that? But we're engineers, so we're like, let's look, let's see. We actually have the tools, we have the abilities. Let's go look. So we took the revenue graph and we overlaid traffic graphs for the site, right? And all the web servers and whatnot. So we take that and we correlate, and we're like, well, traffic was also down when revenue was down. That kind of makes sense, I guess. If we have fewer users coming to the site, we're gonna make less money. That's really weird though, actually. Why was traffic down? We didn't do anything that should have caused that, not that we know of. Well, let's see, maybe the servers weren't healthy, right? If the servers aren't healthy, they can't process the traffic, that might be a problem. So we overlaid load time. And we're like, no, we know where our spikes are. We know when it's a problem. Oh my God, something bad's happening. It's not corrupted blood, right? Okay. I turn that off on my phone so nothing bad ever happens. Ops pro tip. See, sometimes you have too much monitoring. All right, anyway, so we look at the load time. We're like, no, we know where our spikes are. There were no spikes during that. Load time was actually fine. This should all be good. And then, of course, I love developers. You may notice I've done a lot of development, but I have this Postgres shirt on because I just feel like databases need champions. So at some point, a developer is always going to say when there's an issue, maybe it's the database. Yeah. It's not. It's never the database. It is not going to be a database. I know you think it's a database. All right. But we have graphs. Let's look at the database. We overlay the database. I'm like, that is about the flattest line on this whole thing. It is not the database. The database is fine. The database doesn't even care that you are alive, okay? So it's not the database. So we're like, what is going on here? We spent some time looking into this, trying to figure out what was going on. What we eventually found was we had a metric on email bounces. Yes. So what was happening was they had fallen a filter of some new spam, kind of trap thing, not trap, but regulation. They didn't have their DKIM signed or whatever. Not an email guy, clearly. Anyway, so their bounce rate went up, right? And if fewer people are getting their emails, it's marketing emails that they're sending out, fewer people are clicking, fewer people are going to the web, fewer orders getting processed, revenue numbers go down. Right? And so then it's a matter of, now we know it's email bounces, let's go figure out what the issue is there and solve that so we get deliverability back. And what was weird was it was kind of a temporary thing. As you see, the revenue kind of went right back up. So it was just a little spat every now and then. You learn this with payment providers and email systems. They just get uptight about things every now and then. And so they'll just bounce 100,000 of your emails just for no reason, just to see if you're paying attention. Whatever. The thing about that was, what if we hadn't actually had email bounces being monitored? And I'm sure that there is a story that didn't make it to a conference talk that made it to that metric being a thing we collected, right? Somebody had some pain there and said, we better start monitoring all the metrics for bounces and deliveries and all that stuff. So, and there are now service providers that do that stuff. If it hadn't been monitored, certainly we would have started monitoring that stuff at that point. Luckily, we had it. And that's where I'm saying, visibility into all the things, you need some level of it. You need to be able to go figure it out. Now, we actually had the metric in place, so it was much easier to put the graph on. If we didn't, we still had the log, so we had some ability. We could have recreated that and probably figured it out, but it would have been hard. Much like testing, instrumentation on your production systems also probably never done. Right? Probably a thing that has evolved over time because your production systems are, they're evolving over time as well. And speaking of over time, I think I'm actually maybe over time. So let's give you a TLDR on this whole talk. You're like, wait a minute, there's a TLDR? See, things are going bad. I know, there's issues, there's alarms going off, phones are ringing. All right, testing and monitoring, and not testing or monitoring, right? You need both. Holistic, life is about balance. Understand the business that you're in. There are personal reasons why you may want to do that. But there are also engineering reasons why you may want to do that. So understand the business that you're in. And I use that term business, right? It's what is the organizational goal here? What are we trying to accomplish? Have metrics about that. Instrument as much as you can, right? Figure out ways to go in and look at the system. Doesn't mean you have to have a graph for everything. I would say if you're evaluating tools and you have a choice, figure out something that can take basic metric collections and generate graphs on the fly, and that's an easy process. because that's much more useful than having, going through 200,000 graphs, like, is being able to just pull up a metric and say, like, it's collected in a data store, and then we just generate the graphs for it. That's a useful thing. Monitor things that are impactful, right? Again, going back to those KPIs and organizational goals, what is going to have an impact on your business? Those are things, that should also be actionable as you're monitoring them. If you're going to build alerts on those, they need to be actionable and be real emergencies. For anyone that's out there on call, I still have those issues. And hopefully, like, that'll get you some ability, to keep track of what's going on, to stay safe, and all of that stuff. Like I said, I'm over time, so thanks everybody. Don't forget to wash your hands, and I'll see you at the beer.